Welcome back to Holiness to the Lord, where this time we'll be covering Genesis chapters 4 through 6. So in chapter 4, verses 3 and 4, in the book of Moses, it fleshes it out a bit more, but it's obvious that Adam and Eve have been taught and have taught their children to make sacrifices to God, which is a cool detail. Moving on to verses 5 and 6, it's interesting to note that Cain gets feedback from God. Cain knew if his offering was accepted or not, and he also talked with the Lord. Jump over to verse 10, and it says, Abel's blood cried up from the ground. This time that blood is in condemnation, but it's interesting because in temple themes, in that sort of idea, that blood is spilled for justification, for redemption, for atonement. It's interesting to see how blood spilled cuts both ways. Starting in verse 14, Cain says, "From thy face shall I be hid." So Cain is cast out of God's presence, just like his parents. But it's interesting to note the differences. Where Adam and Eve were innocent and transgressed, Cain knowingly sinned and rebelled against God. Jumping over to verse 17, it's good to note that there are two different Enochs. That can get very confusing. And then verse 17 and 18 highlights the importance of lineage in the Bible. It focuses on the line of fathers and sons, which is patriarchal in nature. The priesthood is passed down from father to son, and so it's focusing on family, but it's also focusing on the authority of God. And I think it's interesting getting into chapter 5 because it continues to follow the lineage, and the thing it highlights is the ages of various people. So we start off with Adam being almost the oldest person who lived, and you see this kind of general downward trend with the exception of Methuselah and Enoch. I think this is really interesting because if you look at symbolism used in the scriptures, often associated with numbers, the number 9 is finality. It is a conclusion. So Adam living to be 930 years old, like it is the conclusion of his life. He has lived a full and a good life. And 3 is perfection. It alludes to God. So Adam had a good and fulfilled life, and it was perfect for all intents and purposes. And from there, the ages decline. And the other notable one, I think, is Methuselah, which was also 900 years, and then 69, where 6 is just short of 7. 7 is considered perfection, completion, kind of like the 7 days of the creation, where 6 is considered just shy of that, considered a poor imitation of 7. And so even at man's oldest age, he still isn't able to hit perfection. He's just able to get close. Also think it's very interesting that Enoch is highlighted as, and this is not Cain's son, not Cain's descendant Enoch, this is the good Enoch. It highlights specifically in this that he was taken up by the Lord, that he didn't die. And so I think that's a cool emphasis that everyone goes out their physical life and they live righteous lives and they pass down the priesthood and things are excellent, but they still end up physically dying. Where Enoch was righteous enough that he didn't physically die, he was taken up into the rest of the Lord, the presence of the Lord, and death had no power over him. I think that's very symbolic and reminiscent of the entire idea of the plan of salvation, the plan of redemption, and what God wants for everyone. If you go to the end of that chapter, it says that Enoch walked with God. He walked in his presence, so God walked with him. It's also interesting to note that God walked with Enoch. You only walk with someone if you have legs. It's that whole idea that as members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, we know the revealed truth is that God has a body of flesh and bones. It's a resurrected, perfected body, but it's a body. Anyway, it's cool. Moving on to chapter 6. In verses 2 and 3, it highlights sons of God and daughters of man. I think this is a really cool dichotomy because we are all children of God, and the beginning of Genesis really emphasizes how we are the offspring of God. We are the children of God. But when it comes down to it, we get to choose whether we are adopted into his family and called by his name. There is an aspect of being born into the covenant, being born into a knowledge of the gospel, but also you have to choose it, you have to accept it, you have to be committed to it for it to have any meaning. So the sons of God are those who have been born in the covenant, those who have kept the commandments. Daughters of man symbolizing those who have chosen to follow man instead of God. Again, in verse 9, we get that Noah walked with God. Again, pretty cool. Entering into the presence of the Lord. Very, very temple themed. And then verse 14, God talks about putting pitch on the ark. Now, another word for pitch is to seal. It's cool that Noah and his family got into a boat that was sealed to protect them, to keep them safe from physical death, but that could also be very, symbolic of being sealed to be prevented from, spiritual death. And anyway, cool temple themes. It's also interesting that God lays out the blueprint for the ark, where there's only a couple instances of God laying out blueprints. He does it for the ark, for the tabernacle. I think he also does it for the temple. Don't quote me on that. But it's really awesome. In verse 16, there's a footnote in the King James that says that the window, some rabbis believed that it was a precious stone that shone, that put off light. Tashar. I'm not good with Hebrew. Anyway, and it's also interesting that there are 3 tiers to the ark, 3 tiers of salvation, kingdoms of glory, cool things. And I also think it's interesting how in verse 17 it mentions the breath of life, hearkening back to the whole idea of the creation. And then in verse 18, God establishes a covenant with Noah. Despite already establishing a covenant with Adam and presumably with all of Adam's children in that patriarchal line, the Lord renews and makes his covenant directly with each new generation in a very personal manner. And that to me is very reminiscent of the temple and how we get to each take up individual promises and covenants with God to be promised to return back to him. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you next time.